Mrs. Parks and I started the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development in 1987. Mrs. Parks insisted if they were going to name an institute after her, that her husband had to be recognized too, because he sacrificed so much for our country and, of course, in protecting her to make sure that she traveled safely and that they had a home to live in. People were not always kind to them, and Mrs. Parks never talked a lot about the hard times that she had in her life, but there were many. And therefore, when we decided that we wanted to have an institute in her honor, she said that it would have to be in her husband's honor too. And we had no problem with that. I had met Mr. Parks on several occasions because many times I had either ridden home with Mrs. Parks when she was driving, or when I started driving, I would take her home and then walk her into the house, and Mr. Parks would be there, and I would always say hello to him, and he would say, hello to me. He was a very serious person and was not always smiling, but he certainly spoke, asked about her day, and she would always come and give him a little hug or little pat on his shoulder, and you could tell that there was definitely a love story there. So I appreciated witnessing that.
So, do you want to talk a little bit about what the Institute does?
The Institute motivates youth between the ages of 11 and 17 to reach their highest potential. And Mrs. Parks recognized, as well as myself, that our youth really needed guidance, that there were things within their midst that they should not be participating. And at that time, unfortunately, many of the young people were not learning social graces. They were not learning how to conduct themselves as young men and young women. And we thought that we could help in that vein. And another important thing was that they did not know their history. And so Mrs. Parks, of course, was a very gifted individual, loved to read and loved to share her knowledge with others, and especially young people. And that's how we started the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development that motivates youth to reach their highest potential.
And is that in Montgomery, Alabama? It's in
No,
Detroit.
that's in Detroit,
What's
Michigan.
down in Montgomery, Alabama?
Well, Mrs. Parks, I didn't know Mrs. Parks when she moved from Montgomery, but she moved from Montgomery in 1957, and and she moved to Detroit because she couldn't get work there. She had work, but they fired her, or they would only call her occasionally, and also it was life-threatening. So therefore, she and Mr. Parks came here, and they had family. Well, she had family primarily here, and her brother lived in Detroit. He was afraid for her life in Montgomery. He had moved here some time ago, and she had cousins that were here. Her first cousins that lived in Detroit. I'm saying here as if I'm in Detroit, although I'm in Washington, D.C. at this time. but she had quite a bit of family that lived in Detroit, and that's the reason that she selected Detroit.
When she passed away, there were 3 funerals.
Yes.
Montgomery, Alabama, Washington, D.C., and Detroit, Michigan.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about, we were on all 3 legs with you.
Absolutely.
And do you have any memories of that?
Oh, of course. I could never, forget that. But I must say that Southwest Airlines was very generous in providing an airplane for the family of Mrs. Parks, as well as other dignitaries. I indeed was included, on that plane. And we, in fact, flew from Detroit to Montgomery, Alabama. That was our first stop. And it was the same type of reception that you would give to a dignitary, president, or a head of state. The reception that the armed services provided when Mrs. Parks was taken off the plane in the casket. And her services in Montgomery were at St. Paul AME Church, and that was the church that she had belonged to in Montgomery for many, many years. And that's where she was eulogized there. From there, Southwest Airlines again took us to Washington, D.C.
Do you remember when the pilot said, as we left Montgomery, Alabama, he was going to tilt left and tilt right, waving goodbye?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And I think that they did that at every stop.
Yep.
At every stop. And when we arrived in Washington, D.C., it was very special too. And I must say that Ted Spiro and H.H. Leonard were a part of this special delegation. And we feel we're family. And that's why we stay here as often as we can when we come to Washington, D.C. It is such a blessing. But when we arrived in Washington, they let us go into the Air Force Base where we were able to disembark and then board buses to go to the United States Capitol. And it was indeed a very awesome event. Mrs. Parks was the first woman to lie in state at the rotunda, and also the first non-political person to lie in state there.